I'm Dr. Gad Saad, author, professor, and advocate for freedom of thought. As someone devoted to freedom, personal responsibility, meritocracy, and free enterprise, I am honored to join Northwood University. Northwood isn't just a university, it's a launch pad for future leaders. Here, students gain the skills to thrive in a global free market economy. It's a place where innovation flourishes, ideas are exchanged freely, and diverse perspectives are celebrated. Guided by the Northwood idea, this institution teaches students to think critically, lead ethically, and act boldly in business and in life. It's higher education rooted in freedom and driven by purpose. At Northwood, free thinkers become catalysts and courageous leaders find their spark. If you're ready to unlock your potential and make a lasting impact, Northwood University is where it begins. Discover America's free enterprise university. Visit northwood.edu. Hi, everybody. This is Gad Saad. Today I have another fantastic guest with me, Timothy Sandefur. How are you doing, sir?
Very good. Thank you for having me on.
Pleasure to have you. Today, what I'd like to talk about is this book, which is not your latest book. You have an additional book after that came out in 2022. But let me just, this is Frederick Douglass. Regrettably, too few people know about him, or not enough people know about him. Let me just mention briefly who you are. You're the Vice President for Litigation at the Goldwater Institute's Scharf Norton Center for Constitutional Litigation. You are the author of many books, including Cornerstone of Liberty, Property Rights in the 21st Century America, The Right to Earn a Living, The Conscience of the Constitution, and The Permission Society. What's the title of your latest book? I didn't have a chance to write it down.
The latest one is called Freedom's Furies. It's the story of how the modern libertarian movement was largely started by three women who all knew each other and wrote books the same year, 1943, that kind of kick-started the free market movement in the modern world.
Beautiful. So maybe we could start with what is the Goldwater Institute, since you play such an important role there, and then we'll dive into this beauty right here. Take it
Sure,
away.
but the Goldwater Institute is a free market organization headquartered in Phoenix, Arizona, and we do research, litigation, and legislation to promote and advance freedom both in Arizona and across the United States. Probably our most prominent, well-known success is the right to try legislation that was adopted a few years ago that allows terminally ill patients to use medicine that has been approved for safety but not yet for sale by the FDA. That was signed into federal law, oh gosh, 5 or 6 years ago now, and that was one of our projects.
So is it, I mean, I'm assuming you probably have different divisions. There's a legal division, there's a sort of spreading libertarian ideas division.
Right.
How is the institute organized?
That you're right about that, and I'm one of the head lawyers at the institute, so I do litigation, suing the government for a living, which is the greatest job in the world. I would do it for free if I had to. In fact, we sort of do it for free because we don't charge our clients. We represent them pro bono to set important legal precedent. And then in my spare time, when I have some, I also try to, as you said, advance the general ideas of liberty by things like writing books about Frederick Douglass.
Right. So we'll get to Frederick Douglass in a second. You're, I think, associated. I saw in another bio somewhere where I was doing some Google searches on you. You're associated with ASU, correct? Arizona State University. And
That's right. I served as a professor there last year.
I think we may know some common people in that last, I think it was February, I was invited by Professor Jonathan Barth to speak at the Center for American Institutions for America. Is that who you were connected with?
Yeah, that's right. There are actually, ASU is really fortunate that we have a large number of centers that is, dedicated professors who are devoted to teaching people about freedom and teaching people about free speech and economic liberty and all these other issues. And the area I was teaching in was in the economic liberty area.
Got you. Okay, so before we get to this guy right here, by the way, am I right in saying he looks sort of like an aristocratic, regal, right? I mean, just
He
I'm
does.
saying his morphology, right? The way he looks, you think he's like a Nubian king from somewhere in, right?
And in fact, that's an important point about Douglass. Douglass was actually the most photographed American of the 19th century. He loved having his picture taken. And every time he had an opportunity to, he would have a photograph taken. And a few years ago, they published a book that contained all of the known photographs of Douglass. And amusingly, there's only a single one in which he's smiling. Every one of
Wow.
them, he has that serious, regal look. By the way, the cover of my book has a picture that he took in Hillsdale, Michigan, when he was speaking there in the 1860s, because my alma mater is Hillsdale College, and I also happen to think it's the best photograph of him that I've ever seen. So we managed to get permission from the school to publish that picture on the cover.
You know, I didn't know that he was connected to Hillsdale. I was privileged to deliver a plenary lecture organized by Hillsdale in Naples, Florida, where I
Yeah.
got a chance to meet the president of Hillsdale, Larry Arnn, and so on. I'm currently, by the way, a visiting professor and global ambassador at Northwood University, which is also a university that is founded on many of these freedom. It's known as the Free Enterprise University. Maybe you could tell us a bit about Hillsdale. I know this is not supposed to be a free promo for Hillsdale, but they're certainly doing some good stuff. Tell us about that. I want to then talk about Chapman, and I promise we'll come back to Frederick Douglass. Take it away.
Sure. Well, the Hillsdale is best known for being a very prominent free market school that teaches about individual liberty, private property rights, and economic liberty. I'm a graduate from class of 1998, and then I'm a graduate, as you mentioned, of Chapman University, which is in Southern California. I went to law school there, and so I'm rather proud to boast that both of my degrees come from colleges that were started by abolitionists.
Wow. So here is, I don't think I've ever mentioned the name publicly, but hey, after a few years, maybe it passes the statute of being courteous. I had regrettably a very negative experience at Chapman, although I was very, very excited to be connected to them. In 2011, they reached out to me on one of my visits to Newport Beach. I was a visiting professor for several years at University of California, Irvine, and I lived in Newport Beach, and so I knew the area well. And so at the time, the president of Chapman was Jim Doty, and the chancellor of Chapman was Daniele Strupa, who subsequently became the president of Chapman. Do these names ring any bells for you?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay. And so both Doty and certainly Strupa were supposedly incredibly excited at the prospect of hiring me. They were developing these sort of center of world-class excellence, and they wanted me to build one based on my work at the intersection of biology and consumer behavior and so on. And it was all done. It was all set. My wife and I are excited. We're returning to Newport Beach. And then, as often happens, although they never admitted to this, some faculty members got very upset that, the really nasty Gad Saad was coming to Chapman. They short-circuited that thing, and for the next 5 years, Strupa and some of the senior folks tried to bring me to Chapman every time for it to fail. So I'm thinking that maybe they don't quite have the testicular fortitude that Hillsdale has. Is that a fair assessment, or am I?
Well, I wouldn't know. I graduated from law school in 2002, so it was a while ago, and I didn't go there for the to the undergraduate school, so I can't speak for that. But they do have. When I was there, it was certainly the most fair law school for a person who believes in individual liberty and free markets that you could imagine. There was a large number of faculty who took these ideas very seriously. And for those of you out there listening who don't know what the legal world is like, what is like in the practice of law, it is so far to the left that you have a hard time imagining how bad it is for those of us who believe in individual rights, economic liberty, private property. Those concepts are regarded as antique superstitions at best by the overwhelming majority of law school faculty. And I was very fortunate not to have that experience at Chapman, and I'm a very proud alum of Chapman University.
Beautiful. All right, let's get into this guy. Tell us the story of Frederick Douglass, and then we can talk about why he's not as known as he should be.
Yeah, so Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland in 1818 to a enslaved mother whom he never saw after the age of 7, and a white father whom he never found out who he was. He grew up in Baltimore. He was sent to Baltimore at an early age to be sort of the servant boy for the son of some relatives of his master. And he lived in Baltimore for a while, and he immediately took to the idea of learning. The story, as he tells it, is that the woman Sophia Auld, who was his mistress in Baltimore, started teaching him to read the Bible. And when her husband found out, he exploded. He said, how dare you teach a slave to read? If you teach a slave to read, pretty soon he'll be wanting his freedom. And Douglass later remarked that this was the first anti-slavery lecture he had ever heard. So he became determined to learn how to read, and he tricked the neighborhood white children into teaching him the alphabet, and he began secretly learning to read from abolitionist newspapers and abolitionist speeches that he found in the papers or books of the area. And when he became a teenager, he became so much determined to oppose slavery that his masters decided to punish him and sent him to live with a man named Edward Covey, who ran what was sort of a torture facility in rural Baltimore to break slaves, to make them enslaved. And the way he would do this was to break their spirit. So he would beat them every week for infractions, real or imaginary, and in an effort to try and destroy their sense of self and their desire for a better world. And Douglass, in his memoirs, he says this actually worked against him. It basically broke him down, until one day when he passed out from heat stroke working out in the fields, and his master beat him for that. And Douglass finally decided to stand up for himself, and he fought back. And he and Covey fought for, Douglass says, about an hour, until Covey finally stumbled away, unable to beat Douglass. And Douglass said that the lesson he learned from this is, he used to quote a line from the poet Lord Byron, "He who would be free must himself strike the blow." And from that point for the rest of his life, he was determined to value himself and to defend his freedom and the freedom of his enslaved brethren. So he escaped on the Underground Railroad to first to New York City, and then moved from there to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he got a job working. Well, he got odd jobs. He worked caulking ships. He worked at pumping the bellows at a blacksmith shop, and so forth. And he joined the anti-slavery movement, which was headquartered in Massachusetts. And he became a lecturer for William Lloyd Garrison, who was the head of the Massachusetts wing of the abolitionist movement. Now, here's what I think is really interesting about Douglass. Garrison he believed that the Constitution of the United States was an evil document because he said it was pro-slavery. And Douglass at first agreed with that. I mean, he was 20 years old. He hadn't really read that much about the Constitution. He agreed with all that. And he then went on a lecture tour to Europe, and he was in Europe for almost a year. And he came back from Europe, and he had changed his mind. And the reason he had changed his mind is because he had met in Britain, he had met with a lot of people who had worked within the system as anti-slavery activists and had accomplished a lot. So Douglass then returns to the United States, and he's like rethinking what Garrison had taught him. And he joins the New York wing of the abolitionist movement. And the New Yorkers were led by a guy named Gerrit Smith. And Smith believed that the Constitution was a fundamentally anti-slavery document and a good thing. And Douglass embraced that position, and that was the position he held for the rest of his life. Douglass, of course, goes on to become a very important spokesman for the black community during and after the Civil War, ends up becoming basically the ambassador to Haiti, and retires a prominent, highly respected scholar and author and orator, always believing that the U.S. Constitution was a good and anti-slavery document. His phrase was, the Constitution interpreted as it ought to be interpreted is a glorious liberty document.
So basically, Douglass would get an F in any test taught today in any university in the United States.
That's exactly right. He would be shunned because today's intellectuals have adopted the Garrisonian view that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document and therefore evil. And Douglass said, he said, take a look at the Constitution and find the word slave or slavery in it. And it doesn't appear anywhere in the U.S. Constitution. He said, therefore, those who argue that the Constitution is pro-slavery are kind of in the position of a person who claims to own property and then produces a deed that contains no description of the property. He said the burden of proof should be on those who claim the Constitution is pro-slavery, and find me the proof. He said there's only 4 clauses in the Constitution that even obliquely mention slavery, and those have innocent explanations. Now, let me pause to explain how lawyers interpret the Constitution. You start out with rules of interpretation in order to interpret any written document, especially the Constitution. And the first rule is only that which is written down on the page is the Constitution, not the subjective personal intentions of the people who wrote it, just the words on the page. And then the second rule is that you interpret the Constitution as pro-slave, or pro-freedom rather, as pro-individual rights whenever you possibly can. In other words, you interpret it as innocently as you possibly can. You give it a good faith interpretation. So with those 2 rules in mind, you look at the 4 provisions of the Constitution that seem to be pro-slavery. That's the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave clause, the import-export clause, and the clause that prohibits the repeal of the import-export clause. And what I mean by the import-export clause is there's a provision that prohibits Congress from interfering with the slave trade until the year 1800. So Douglass says, well, you look at these clauses, the 3/5 clause that counts a slave as 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportioning Congress, it does not use the word slave. And in fact, it rewards states that abolish slavery, because if you abolish slavery, you would get more representation in Congress. It certainly does not protect or preserve slavery in any way. Or take the fugitive slave clause. It also does not use the word fugitive. It says persons from whom labor is due. And as Douglass pointed out, labor is not due from slaves because they're the victims of an injustice. Labor is due from apprentices or indentured servants. And in fact, it is true that runaway apprentices or runaway indentured servants was a big problem in colonial America. So it makes sense for the Constitution to refer to them. And so anyway, you go down the list and you find these innocent interpretations of the Constitution. And although those might seem like a stretch, you have to remember your rule of interpretation, that you interpret the Constitution as pro-freedom whenever you possibly can. In the alternative, notice how hard it is to make a pro-slavery argument for the Constitution. That's even more of a stretch, right? It doesn't mention slavery anywhere. It casts about it no protection. And there are provisions of the Constitution that are inconsistent with slavery, such as the Due Process Clause that says you can't deprive people of freedom without due process of law. Slavery obviously violates that. The Privileges and Immunities Clause in Article 4 says that no state can deprive an American of the privileges and immunities of their citizenship. Well, blacks are Americans. So states can't deprive them of their rights, and yet slavery did, right? So Douglass makes this argument that if you interpret the Constitution correctly, it's actually fundamentally anti-slavery and gives the federal government the power to abolish slavery if it wants to. And then he said in 1861, when the Civil War started, he said, see, I was right. Because it was the southern states that had to try and get out of the Constitution in order to protect slavery. So that proves that he was correct, according to Douglass.
So everything that you just said, what percentage of American universities would have a course where the gist of everything that you said would be found in the syllabus of some course versus the exact opposite of what you just said?
Probably not a large number. I was not taught it in school. I learned most of this on my own. In fact, after law school, I had really not known. And this is not some trivial thing. This is not some obscure movement, by the way. I mean, these pro-Constitution, anti-slavery people like Frederick Douglass or like Senator Charles Sumner, these were the people who wrote the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So if you want to understand the U.S. Constitution, if you don't understand the pro-Constitution, anti-slavery view, you don't understand it at all. And yet I wasn't taught it in law school or in college or in high school or anything. I basically had to learn it on my own.
So if we were to put him within the pantheon of historical American figures, be it in terms of the social justice and so on, and in the proper use of that term, not the sort of the woke sense, or in the more just general great Americans, does he have his rightful place, or is he a forgotten individual?
Actually, Gad, it's actually worse than either of those options. The real problem is that he has been co-opted by the left. The left tries to use Douglass in order to prove that the fundamental evil of America. And the way that this has been accomplished by historians and scholars, and I use historians in a very loose sense. I mean, we're talking about people like Howard Zinn, the way that they use Douglass is to focus on his early life And I mentioned that early in life, he agreed with Garrison that the Constitution was evil and then changed his mind. And what you will find in your typical textbooks is they'll talk about Douglas's early life and then totally ignore what came after that. Or even worse, some scholars have tried to dismiss him or even said terrible things about him. There are some scholars I mentioned in the book, some scholars who say that Douglas was actually, he secretly wanted to be white. And that's why he endorsed the Constitution out of this nefarious, self-hating sort of, he was somehow a racist because he believed that, you know, it's truly insane. And yet you find this nonsense still being propagated. I mean, or you get Douglas often ignored. Like the 1619 Project, for instance, mentions Douglas's name, I think, one time and does not address any of the substance of his views. And it was only after my book came out, by the way, that Hannah Nicole Jones finally actually read Douglas, and she put this on. In fact, we're approaching the anniversary. It was around Christmas time of, I think it was 5 years ago now, that she put on Twitter that she was reading Douglas, and you know, I tweeted back, I was like, well, you know, that's a good thing. You know, he was pro-Constitution. And she had obviously never heard of it. Of course, she's in the habit of deleting all of her tweets in order to not be held accountable for what she says. So you can't find this online anymore. But it was only a few years after my book came out that she even bothered reading Douglas and discovering that there's this whole range of Black political opinion dating back to before the Civil War that says, you know, maybe America's not a fundamentally racist, evil country.
Since you mentioned Black Americans, what do you think of this guy?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Oh,
no, I think it's impossible not to admire Dr. Sowell and Walter Williams and the school that he has inspired.
You know, he's, as you probably know, he's still alive, and
published a book. He just published. How do you do that? God, I hope I have half as much intellectual energy when I'm that age.
I think 5% would be pretty good.
Yeah.
Here's another guy, specifically because you were talking about sort of Black individuals, although of course they transcend race. Although this guy was rather racially motivated. Do you know who this gentleman is?
No, I heard you mention him during your preview, but I have not heard of him.
Okay, so Steve Biko. Let me tell you a quick story, because I'd love to see if we can draw parallels between all of these, you know, heroic figures. So Steve Biko, I first heard of him as I mentioned in that prelude. I first came across his work in a 1987 movie called Cry Freedom. He was an anti-apartheid activist who was killed by the apartheid regime, you know, tortured and so on. Now, he resonated with me because, well, I often implore people to activate their inner honey badger, because being a honey badger is to be fierce. I mean, in this case, ideologically, defend your principles, don't cower, and so on. And he wrote a book called I Write What I Like, right? Which is very much sort of the call to arms for my entire career. No one is going to stop me from saying a word. Now, what was beautiful about, so then I just discovered, we were at a book antiquarian place owned by a friend of mine, and my wife, as she's browsing, she goes, "Oh, I think you like this guy, right?" And so I ended up buying this biography from the 70s and then read it recently. Now, Biko and Douglas share this sort of very noble, as I mentioned earlier, not so much in their morphology, but in the way they conduct themselves, right? Yeah. Biko talked about sort of raising the Black man's consciousness, right? I don't have to justify who I am and so on. But some have accused him of being a socialist, of being anti-white, although I didn't really read into that. Would Frederick Douglass be considered someone who, in trying to elevate Black people, was trying to put down white people, or was he sort of a universalist? We're all equal, commonly linked in our universal brotherhood.
Oh, very emphatically, he believed in racial equality and did not believe in what is often called Black pride. In fact, he was really concerned about this because there were movements to that effect during his own life that tried to inculcate a sense of basically pro-Black racism within the Black community. And Douglas was very much opposed to this and very worried about what it would do if it caught on in his day. And he similarly, there was efforts both before and after the Civil War, to force Black Americans to colonize, to leave the United States and colonize Africa or Central America, or after the war to persuade them to do so. And Douglass was also emphatically against that. He said Black Americans are American citizens and should cherish their American citizenship. They've earned it, God knows, by their true blood, sweat, and tears, and they should never be persuaded to let it go. And he said the problem with the colonization nonsense or the Black pride nonsense, he said, is that it teaches Black Americans that there is no country for them, that they aren't entitled to the American dream, and it doesn't inculcate any hope. It simply teaches them cynicism and despair. And he said, and white supremacists will take advantage of that. If the Black world teaches Black people that Black people have no role in America and that America is a white supremacist nation, Douglass said, well, then we are surrendering. I mean, then what ability do we have to withstand the white racists? Instead, our position should be that we're all Americans, all entitled to the Constitution and all equally entitled to our freedom. And you mentioned the nobility thing. That was very crucial. I think that Douglass's most important contribution as an intellectual was his connection of the virtue of personal pride with the value of political freedom. I don't know, in the history of libertarian thought, I know of no thinker before Douglass who emphasized that connection to anywhere near that degree. I mean, you can find in John Locke or Thomas Jefferson, they do say, you have to value yourself if you want to defend freedom. But Douglass is the only one who says this is absolutely crucial, that you have to believe yourself worthy of freedom if you're going to defend that freedom. And there's most interesting example of this is he wrote an article encouraging Black Americans to enlist in the Army during the Civil War. And he gives a whole list of reasons of why you should join the Army. And what's interesting to me is what's not on the list. Nowhere does he say you should join the Army to serve your country. Because Douglass would have said, we don't owe it to the country. The country has abused us so miserably through slavery. Instead, all of his examples, all of his reasons are essentially, you owe it to yourself. You need to build a sense of personal pride, and you have to learn how to use guns to defend yourself, and all these sorts of things. Those are the arguments that he musters because he emphasizes so much the value of psychological independence relating to political freedom.
As you were saying that link that you talked about, I literally got goosebumps because in maybe using other words, well, not maybe, in using other words, I think that's exactly what Biko was espousing. And so I would love to see whether it be you or someone else who's an expert on either or both to draw that explicit.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm going to have to read this book.
I really do. And I'm just going to put it up for you one more time. It's Donald Woods was a white Afrikaner, but who was very, very liberal, anti-apartheid, who was the editor of one of the major newspapers. They forged this incredible brotherhood between the two of them, friendship. So I think there's really some interesting links. Now, let's link Frederick Douglass to some of the contemporary wokeness that we see. And before I do that, let me talk about another, of course, historic Black American, Martin Luther King, right? In the I Have a Dream speech, I mean, literally every single tenet of wokeness is exactly the opposite of what Dr. King said there. I'm going to assume, without having read the primary sources of what Frederick Douglass talked about, he would be primarily anti-woke, yes?
Oh, yes. But that's not to say that he would have agreed with King in everything by any means. So what I think is really interesting about Douglass as an intellectual compared to Martin Luther King on one hand and Malcolm X on the other is that he would have totally agreed with King's argument that the Declaration of Independence, as King puts it in the I Have a Dream speech, that the Declaration is a promissory note that America must make good on, that all men are created equal, that blacks are Americans just as much as whites are and are entitled to their liberty. But he would have disagreed very firmly with King's anti-violence peace ideal. Douglass very firmly believed in the right of self-defense and of taking up arms to defend yourself, and he would have agreed very much with Malcolm X in that regard. On the other hand, he would have strongly disagreed with Malcolm's black nationalism. He would have firmly disagreed with the idea that, Plymouth Rock landed on us and this sort of thing. Douglass would have said that this country is our country too, and we have the right to defend it, including with physical violence when that proves necessary.
Right, beautiful. One last link between all of these great gentlemen, and then we can move on to maybe some contemporary political realities. Thomas Sowell talks about, I hope I don't botch the story, but how when he moved to New York City, one of his uncles or some older mentor had taken him to the New York Public Library, where he sort of was amazed. Boy, there's this building with all of these books that I can just take out and read. And of course, that led to his at least cognitive emancipation, right? He becomes a man of letters and he reads. I mean, you told somewhat a similar story in terms of how Douglass, learned to read, and of course that leads him to these great heights. How do we teach the Black community in the United States that it's through knowledge, through education, that we can all elevate ourselves? And before I cede the floor to you, I often tell the story, and forgive me to those who have heard me mention it before. So I'm Jewish. We come from a history of, putting a lot of effort on learning and so on. When after my MBA, my mother had heard that one of my older brothers was trying to convince me to work with him in his company rather than immediately pursuing my PhD, she takes me to the side, with great worry and says, do you want people to remember you as somebody who dropped out of school? Because for her, having had a bachelor's degree in mathematics and computer science and an MBA, and stopping at that point would bring great shame to the family, right? And so, whereas of course, what regrettably much of today's Black culture has internalized is a sense of the exact opposite of that. I'm a victim, and so on. How do we get them to appreciate what both Douglass and Sowell understood? Learn, enrich your mind, and you will be free.
Well, I think that's a hard question for me to answer. Obviously, I don't live in the Black culture myself, and so I feel awkward trying to prescribe for people. But I would say that I don't think that this is a lesson the Black community is unaware of. I just think that the Black world, and this is true also, by the way, of many sections of the white world, is kind of torn between these two visions of what life should be like. And you might label them loosely the optimistic and the pessimistic vision. And the optimistic vision that says, there is opportunity out there, and if there's not, you can make it. You can make those opportunities if you go out there and work hard enough, and you can have success and vindication in life. And then there's the nihilistic view, the negative view that says, the game is rigged, there's no hope, and so forth. And I think there's that tension within the Black community. And I do think it's unfortunate that it's since at least 1966, let's say, maybe 68, so much of, I would put it this way, so much of white attention has been devoted to the nihilistic sector of the Black public community, of the Black public opinion world, so that when you look at a movie or a TV show that's supposedly about Black life in America, it's very often it'll be made by white producers in Hollywood, and they're trying to be authentic. And in their minds, the authentic Black world is the life of thuggery. There was this movie that just came out about this just recently. I can't think of the title of it now, that it was nominated for an Oscar. That's about a Black writer who finds that the only way that he can sell his novel is to...
Oh, I saw it. I saw it with my wife and children. Yes, amazing.
And it was a marvelous commentary on exactly this phenomenon, that it's not necessarily that the Black community has embraced the culture of thuggery, although there is too much of that, of course, but that's also true in white communities. But the real problem, I think, is that elite opinion in Hollywood and elsewhere thinks that the authentic Black experience is over here on the misery end of the spectrum, on the hopelessness end of the spectrum. And so I've always thought it ironic that they use the term woke for this attitude, because it's not woke, it's dreamlessness, right? If you read Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is the ultimate anti-Frederick Douglass. Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has made his entire living off of total nihilism. Nihilism to such a degree that he basically cheers on September 11th in his first book, yes. Right? If you read Ta-Nehisi Coates gets the National Book Award, he gets treated like a great intellectual and so forth. This is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. He teaches dreamlessness. The word dream is an epithet in his book. It's a curse word in his book. And of course, when most people think of the word dream in America, they don't even think about the term American dream. The first thing they think of is Martin Luther King, right?
Right.
And he treats this with contempt and scorn. And so he's dreamless and thinks he's awake, but it's not the case. In fact, he's in the worst kind of sleep, which is a dreamless sleep. And he is a sleepwalker, essentially. And there's a poem by Vachel Lindsay that touches on this, where he says the world's worst crime is not that the young die, but that they die so dreamlessly. And that's the world Coates wants. Coates is, and the anti-Frederick Douglass woke 1619 crowd, that's what they're aiming at, is the dreamless life. Whereas Douglass would have said, America is consecrated to a dream. America is three things. It's the physical environment, land, rocks, trees, and rivers, and it's the people, the physical human beings, and then it's a third thing, which is the dream. And every other nation in the world has those first two things already. What makes America unique and separates it and makes it great is that third thing, the dream, which is what Coates and his ilk reject, and what Douglass, I think, articulated greater than any other American, with the possible exception of Martin Luther King.
Wow, what a muscular endorsement of America. You should be going out on the political circuit. Right? Have you ever thought about going into politics?
I could never be elected to anything because I believe these ideas too strongly.
Well, I say almost something similar when people say, hey, why don't you run for Canadian Prime Minister? So I say, are you kidding me? I wouldn't last 1 second. I'm way too honest to
right.
like literally 5 minutes in politics.
Right.
I would insult everybody. I mean, it's not insult, but offend everybody and so on.
Yeah.
Okay, let's link some of these things to what's going on currently. What's your mood like given the recent November 5th elections? And we can take it from there and talk about other things.
I'm a little hesitant, but I think there is much good to be accomplished. I'm not sure that it will be accomplished.
Why are you hesitant?
Because I'm afraid that the coming administration is not going to be as respectful of the Constitution as it ought to be, and that at best what we can hope for is a system where everything gets bogged down in petty disputes. I think the kinds of change that we need in the United States are important, drastic in some cases. They're deep-rooted, and in order to accomplish that, what you need is a leadership that is devoted to ideas, that understands these ideas very thoroughly, and is willing to stick to principle no matter what. And I don't think that this or any other candidate offered that. And so we'll see. There was good that was accomplished last time around. I think the appointment of Justice Gorsuch is a fine example of the good that can be accomplished, and he's done a lot of good on the bench. But I also think that when we talk about things like, tariffs, which are taxes, just more taxation of the American working class to support the politically well-entrenched. When you talk about that sort of thing, that's not what we need in this country. So we'll see. I think it's going to be a lot of chaos, unfortunately. And chaos is not what we need. What we need is a dedicated leadership that understands free market ideas and individual rights and is willing to push for them.
Do you think that Doge might very quickly be able to cut a lot of the inefficient, useless fat that currently exists in government?
No, I think that they'll be able to identify a lot of inefficient and useless fat, but really the problem isn't so much, well, I guess it depends on how you define inefficient, useless fat. I mean, we're talking about entire departments of the federal government that ought to be shut down. The Cato Institute just recently, I think last week, just published a list of suggestions for Doge to consider, and that would be great to see those implemented. I have, maybe I'm too cynical, but I have little hope to see that we'll actually see those things implemented. I think what we'll see is a report will get written, and then things will get bogged down by special interests who pretend to be Republicans when they're actually Democrats, and so forth and so on. The usual sort of.
Yikes, that's cynical. I was hoping that we could be floating on a cloud of positivity.
Well, and I want to be I don't mean to be cynical. I mean to be realistic. I'm very serious when I say that the changes that need to be made are changes that need to be made by people who understand the policy, the law, the Constitution, and aren't satisfied with just, drinking liberal tears and all this sort of superficial nonsense that we've heard so much in the past decade or so. We're not going to accomplish people we're not going to accomplish good by alienating people and treating them badly. That's what the other side does. And for us to adopt the other side's tactics and say, well, they did it, so it's okay for me. First of all, it's a very childish thing to do. And secondly, it's very counterproductive, because if you become the enemy while fighting the enemy, then you have not actually won. In fact, then your enemy has won, because the thing that gets implemented is the enemy's thing. So if in order to defeat Democrats, I become a Democrat, and then I get elected, well, now guess what? The Democrat's been elected, because that's what I've become, right? So that's what I mean when I mean we have to be realistic about this, and we have to approach reform understanding the policy and the challenges that are presented to us. But I don't see a lot of that in the leadership that's so far been promised. I've seen things like, the attorney general nominee and those sorts of things. So we'll see. Maybe the great thing about being pessimistic is that you get pleasantly surprised instead of being disappointed all the time.
Set your expectations low and then feel good when
right.
you exceed them. Yes, we know this from consumer behavior. If Frederick Douglass, I'm going to come back to contemporary issues, but I want to link it back to this beautiful. And what I love about it, by the way, is you can get the gist of his life in a much less intimidating sized book, right?
That was my goal. I wanted to see if I could do Douglass in 100 pages, which I did not quite manage to do, but pretty close. Of course, any listener should also definitely consult Douglass's own autobiographies. He wrote 3 of them actually in his lifetime, and they are all just masterful.
Yes, beautiful. If he were to be nominated, I hope you appreciate this.
Yeah.
To be nominated into the incoming administration's cabinet, maybe I'll start by giving my prediction where he would have been nominated, and then you can either agree or disagree. I think I got, no disrespect to Senator Rubio, I've got Secretary of State written all over this guy. What do you think?
Yeah, his experience was foreign policy. He was ambassador to Haiti, so there's that. Yeah, I think that something like that, or maybe attorney general. I think that would be a fantastic role for a modern day Frederick Douglass to be attorney general. In fact, the closest figure in today's American politics to Frederick Douglass is probably Clarence Thomas, who has a large portrait of Douglass on the wall of his office at the U.S. Supreme Court building, and has quoted Douglass more than any other justice in American history. So that would be great to see another Frederick Douglass on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Oh, wow, that's cool. All right, are there any other things in terms of contemporary issues that are keeping you up at night? I mean, I'm sure many, and then we can maybe delve into some personal issues. What makes Timothy tick in the morning, and so on and so forth. But maybe we could start with what are some of the, give me the top 2-3 things that are keeping you up at night.
Well, at the Goldwater Institute, what we do is primarily we focus on state level issues. We're particularly focused on state constitutions. A lot of people look at the U.S. Constitution, but they forget about state constitutions, which often contain better protections for individual rights than does the federal Constitution. And so we litigate issues involving things like government subsidies to private businesses, which are actually illegal in most states, and yet people don't realize this. And so we litigate a lot of cases involving this. What's called the gift clause, which are clauses of state constitutions that forbid the government from giving away things. And so we litigate a lot of issues, a lot of cases involving that. We're doing cases in Arizona, Texas, New Jersey, also across the country on that issue. Parental rights is a particular focus of the Institute, protecting the rights of parents to be in charge of their children's upbringing and education, and not government bureaucrats who for many years have often claimed that they know better than parents and can even keep information secret from parents about what's going on in the public schools. We're litigating cases in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals about that, in the courts all across the country. And then economic liberty is another issue that I'm particularly consider important. I think economic freedom, the right to earn a living, is as crucial a right as your right to free speech, private property rights, freedom of religion, or certainly it's more important to most people than the right to vote. If you think about how few people actually vote, and yet everybody thinks of the right to earn a living, to get a job, or to start your own business as a crucial element of the American dream. And so a lot of our energies at the Institute are devoted to protecting that, and that's a lot of what I work on too.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this, the third one last, because it segues into arguably the most painful existential reality that I ever faced a few years ago. When
wow, that's a terrible buildup. Now I feel sorry for you. What happened?
Well, thank you for your empathy. So this book right here, The Parasitic Mind, which is, went on to be a huge success, because I reside in Canada, but the publisher is in the US, I got all the royalties tax-free because my US publisher wouldn't tax me because I'm not a resident or citizen of the US. But Canada, under its world income provision, right? I mean, I could move to Mars on one of Elon's ships,
Yeah.
and if I make money on Mars, that money is largely Canada's, right? And so I had this money that was sitting in my bank account for many months, and then came tax season, right? And now I want you to imagine this, Timothy. There is literally in my personal bank account at the time, I've since incorporated, there's the Quebec government and the Canadian government, and I just hit a send button, and this very large number, which would have secured my retirement. Now, I want to put it in perspective. And here I'm usually a very smiley guy, but I'm going to keep it together. It would take me, in terms of the savings that I make from my salary as a professor, well over 10 more years of working as a professor, given the number that I hit, and it went send, and all that money disappeared. It just went. Okay. Now, for about, literally for a week or two, I was unrecognizable. My children were worried, because I just couldn't make sense of a reality where already on my professorial salary, you're taxing me well over 50%. Then I went and tried to do something. Now, there is something unique about taxing book royalties. Any taxation is problematic, certainly to that kind of punitive level. But when it's your words, when it's your thoughts, when it's me writing about my experience in Lebanon and the fruits of that initiative, the government gets to keep more of it than I do. By the way, it came out to about 58%, the highest rate that you get taxed in the Quebec and federal governments are 25 and 33% respectively. So when you add up my income tax, my property tax, now we have 2 layers of sales tax, which amount to about 15%. So after you've taxed me at nearly 60%, what's left with me, if I go out and spend, you take 15% of that. When you add up all the taxes, I'm lucky if I'm left with about 30 cents to the dollar. So that at the end, when I'm looking at the final statement, Timothy, and I say, my God, I'm this well-known professor with this massive international bestseller, where is my money? How come I have, because people say, how come you don't leave the Canada? Why don't you move to the US? You're this famous professor, blah, blah, blah. Because my bank account doesn't conform with that reality that you think I should have garnered. So could there ever be a world, Timothy, where this insane criminal enterprise is reversed, where I am made whole again, or are we doomed to be parasitically taxed forevermore?
Could there be such a world? Yes, but not in California. When you're describing all this stuff, it sounds like my former home state of California, the way you describe it. Yeah, well, of course, a better world is possible, not just in this, but in many other ways. Ideas got us into this mess, and ideas can get us out of this mess. But it takes the will to respect those who earn the wealth that others redistribute. And one of the crippling problems we have in our culture today is the lack of respect for the hard work and individual enterprise that go into creating wealth, and the right in that wealth that creates. Not just under the doctrines of socialism, obviously, but under its other, its cousins, ideological cousins like wokeness included, that say that what you are is basically belongs to the state, right? You didn't build that philosophy that says that because the government builds a road and you drive on that road, therefore you owe your life's earnings to the government. That attitude has become very pervasive in our society. And it ultimately boils down to, you mentioned how it feels to have your own words taxed. I mean, This is, in a philosophical sense, this is saying that your mind belongs to the state.
Yes.
And therefore, the product of your mind and the product of your labors belongs to the state, so that what you earned for your own retirement gets taken and paid half for the retirement of a bunch of bureaucrats and then half into the pot for the retirement of people who didn't earn it. It's a disgrace.
It's unbelievable. And I mean, I try to think of what are some psychological, if not, as you said, ideas are either good or bad, but what are the impediments to very quickly reversing this? And so here's my, I think, profound and very simple explanation. Look, socialism is a Ponzi scheme. It's the ultimate Ponzi scheme, right? Now, if 95% of the people have a net benefit from keeping the Ponzi scheme alive, because the other 5% of suckers are the ones that you take all the money from to redistribute. So for example, if I post, look, does it make sense that I'm left with very little money having written this book? And people say, you're such a whiner, you're so entitled, you're a famous professor, why don't you put into the system? Well, yeah, obviously, because you're taking my money and it's going to you, right? So how could you ever have a movement that reverses this when the great majority of people who would be the shapers of changing that movement have no benefit in changing it?
Yeah. Well, yes, you know what? You are entitled to the earnings of your own labor. Yes, you are entitled to those earnings. Absolutely. I think, now I don't pretend to be a psychologist, but my own theory is that the root psychological cause of this is the sense of personal worthlessness that is a part and parcel of the philosophy of altruism, which teaches people that they live for the sake of others, that the moral justification for your existence is what you do for other people, which is a lie and has been perpetuated by those in power seeking to retain power for eons, because by teaching you that you belong to the state, not just in a physical sense, or that your earnings belong to the state, but that you are morally worthless if you stand up for your right to exist for your own happiness. I mean, the reason for why America speaks of the pursuit of happiness, right? The life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Whereas in Canada, you have peace, order, and good government, right? Those are psychologically worlds apart from each other. And America was fundamentally based on the principle that I have a right to pursue my own happiness, which of course brings us back to Douglass, because this is what Douglass means when he says, he who would be free must himself strike the blow. What he means is, you have the right to live for your own sake. You do not belong to other people, not just in a political sense, but in a moral sense. The philosophy of altruism and the sense of self-worthlessness that it inculcates is false and is basically invisible shackles on you. And actually, to bring this back to Douglass, by the way, I mentioned at the very beginning that Douglass loved photography. One of the most interesting things Douglass ever did was he delivered a series of lectures on the philosophy of picture making, which I think are the most interesting, certainly among the most interesting things he ever wrote. And his idea was basically what you and I might call a romanticist notion. What he said was, human beings are unique because we create a vision of the self we want to be, and then we try to embody those values. There was a philosopher, Iris Murdoch, who said, man is a being who creates a picture and then tries to be like the picture. And that's exactly what Douglass thought. And so that's why he loved great heroic stories like Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas. Those were his favorite writers, because he said he had this heroic vision of what it means to be a human being, as opposed to the nihilistic vision we were talking about earlier that sees man as helpless and as basically a puppet of circumstances, and that the only way we can seek salvation is to enslave ourselves for the benefit of our fellow slaves, and that I owe my life to satisfying other people, and so forth and so on. Douglass had a very different vision of the world. He said life is full of joy and possibility and opportunity if you will embrace it. And the first step toward doing that is saying, I exist for my own sake, for the pursuit of my own happiness, and I have a right to do so, and nobody has the right to take that away from me, whether it be in the form of deducting money from your bank account, or in Douglass's case, actually shackling you with iron chains.
Well, two points to follow up. Number one, did you know that Thomas Sowell is a big photographer as well? Did you know that?
Oh, excellent. No, I
Yeah,
didn't.
that's one of the
So
things.
was Barry Goldwater.
Is that right? Wow, that's
He was a
now
very
I
well-known
claim to
photographer.
have a big love of photography in that in the abstract sense, I really love the idea. We used to play a game in my family with when the kids were very young, where we would each have, you know, a few minutes to take one photo of anything in the house. And then those 4 photos, so we have 2 children, my wife and I, we would send them to an impartial arbiter who was usually my wife's parents. And then without them knowing who it was, they'd have to judge which was the aesthetically more beautiful.
That's great.
That was really fun. And so I can really appreciate, you know, the idea of sort of finding a moment and freezing it. Although I haven't really practiced much photography. The second point I was going to make is that, and this kind of segues into my next book. My next book is titled Suicidal Empathy. The idea being that empathy, as long as it is targeted to the right people and in the right measure, makes perfect evolutionary sense. So here I'm going to bring in my evolutionary psychology perspective. So it's not as though, you know, we are not empathetic creatures, but we are not orgiastically and indiscriminately empathetic towards all. It makes perfect evolutionary sense for me to be more than willing to jump in front of a moving bus to save my children than I am to save a random stranger. That doesn't make me a callous, selfish individual. It makes me a Darwinian sentient being. And so, in a sense, what parasitic taxation and the social welfare state and so on do, they are anti-human nature, because you and I and everybody else walking on earth, short of those who benefit from the parasitic taxation, have not evolved to say, you know what, let me go out and write these great books so that it could benefit random strangers. I mean, not in terms of the ideas, but in terms of the rewards, the pecuniary rewards that come with me selling those books. So it literally
could not agree more. You're absolutely right. And what really is probably the cap on the moral offense of those who say otherwise is that they label their doctrine of self-sacrifice love. And they say, well, you need to love your fellow man more because you're so greedy and selfish. And this is a doctrine of mutual enslavement that's being taught to us under the name love. Just imagine what it would be like to actually love a person in the way that they're speaking of. To say to your girlfriend, you're going to propose to her, you say, well, dear, I'm going to propose that we get married, not out of any selfish desire on my part, not because it makes me happy as a greedy, selfish person, but for your sake, for the sake of as an act of charity, because I love you in this selfless sense. It's a sacrifice to me to be married to you, but here's what a good person I am that I'm going to do it anyway. Imagine somebody saying that, right? And yet
very romantic.
That's their image of what it means to be a human being. I find that just repulsive.
All right. Last question, because I'm looking at the time. We're almost at the 1 hour mark, but this boy has this flown. We'll love to have you back. You were mentioning the pursuit of happiness as being enshrined within the American ethos. My latest book, my previous book, was it's called The Sad Truth About Happiness, where I had the gall to actually write a book about happiness when people since Epictetus and Seneca and Aristotle have been writing about happiness. Hopefully I had something insightful to say. What is it when Timothy Sandefur wakes up in the morning? What is it that makes him happy as he looks over the looming horizon of that day, of that week, of that year?
I am incredibly fortunate. I'm one of the great good fortunes of my life is that not only do I get to do something that I love for a living and that I care deeply about, and that, you know, I love the history and the law and the philosophy of freedom, and that's what I get to do for a living. But I'm also incredibly fortunate that I have a wife who shares that with me. In fact, she works alongside me here at the Institute. Actually, technically, she's my boss, believe it or not. Which is both at home and at work, but she shares that vision with me. And so I have that is a huge benefit, a huge blessing in life, to not only have a career that you love and care about, but have a partner who cares and loves that, cares about and loves that thing also. So I count my blessings every day. And the secret to happiness, the true secret to happiness, is gratitude. And so I try to practice that every day and be grateful for the great things that I have in my life.
Well, it's funny. Your answer is actually one of the chapters in my happiness book, because I talk about the 2 decisions that you'll make in your life that are most likely to either impart great happiness or great misery, depending on whether you make the right or wrong choice, is choice of spouse and choice of profession. And
That's right.
That's what you led with in terms of your answer. Hey,
Totally.
Timothy, what a joy it is to have met you. Thank you so much for coming on. People,
Thank you.
go out and get this book, Frederick Douglass, Self-Made Man. Stay on the line so we can say goodbye offline, and
Will do.
open invitation to come back anytime.
Thank you.
Cheers.